Good evening. For my final project, I would like to discuss an important battle of the Revolutionary War. Now, there were many important battles for the American Revolution. All of them had an impact in some way at the outcome of the Revolutionary War. But through careful, thorough, and objective research, it is my opinion that the most important battle of the Revolutionary War was fought on June 17th, 1775, and that is the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, I believe that it was the most important battle of the Revolutionary War for three reasons. The first reason is because it showed the British that this was not just a mere rebellion. The colonial army was not going to just cow at the first sign of force that they were shown. They, in fact, were determined to fight for their freedom, and they would not run. Now, that not being said that the colonials would not run in future battles, as evidence shows throughout our textbook and our videos that you've even watched in this class, that the colonials did in fact run in many battles, but just overall on the American spirit, that they were not going to run at the first sign of force. They were going to fight for what they believed was right. Second, it showed the British that the untrained American troops could and would be able to hold their own against the British regulars, considered the finest fighting force in the world. And in fact, they would inflict costly damage on the British at many of the important battles through the Revolution, including the Battle of Bunker Hill. And then third, I believe it showed the British that because of the above two elements, that the British would need to take a more cautious and just a more careful approach in their tactical planning and their battle maneuvering, which would prove advantageous to the American army in future campaigns and future battles. Now, looking at my first point, it's important to look at the preparations for the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, during the days leading up to the beginning of war, the British had already occupied the town of Boston. According to our textbook, The Glorious Cause by Robert Middlecoff, the British troops had been put there by the king to punish the American rebellion, especially for their acts such as the Boston Tea Party, as well as to enforce the Intolerable Acts. Now, second, once the war started, according to Clarence B. Carson's work called The Rebirth of Liberty, it was a key port for the British to control in order to receive supplies and information from England. Now, early in June of 1775, General Gage in Boston was leaning towards the fact that he wanted to occupy the heights outside of Boston. Now, this is a very logical move, considering that the heights would control the harbor and control the town. Now, the Committee of Safety in Massachusetts learned of this, and they immediately, according to Henry Steele Commager and Richard Morse's work, The Spirit of 76, which gives us very good insight into primary sources and first-hand accounts of the Battle of Bunker Hill, that they immediately told the colonial armies and the colonial or American army under General Artemus Ward and his eager subordinates, Colonel William Prescott and Israel Putnam, they were ordered to beat the British to the heights surrounding Boston and occupy Dorchester Heights and especially Bunker Hill. Now, again, according to Richard Morse's, in a letter from Colonel Prescott to excuse me, to John Adams, that they knew that there was going to be much work to be done. So they marched their troops very quickly as they could to the heights surrounding Boston, and starting at midnight began to dig in and start building their fortifications, their redoubts, in order so they would have protection the next morning once sunlight hit. So they worked all through the night and worked very hard in order, and they were mostly done, and thus they achieved their goal of beating the British to the heights of Boston and were thus looking down on them the next morning. Now, when the British awoke to see the heights swarming with about 1,000 to 1,200 American troops, contrary to popular opinion, especially people that I talked to and some resources that I consulted, The British did not just immediately spring forth into action. In fact, according to, again, the Spirit of 76, a first-hand account of an officer under General Gage, the general called in the officers and the other commanders, such as Admiral Clinton and General Burgoyne, and to decide what they were going to do about the Americans occupying the heights. Now, while this was happening, the British Navy in the harbor opened fire on the American fortifications, and though having little success, they did manage to throw a scare into the American troops, but through the courageousness of Colonel Prescott and officers, they held firm and further prepared to meet the British attack as they knew it was going to come. Now, this really, I think, shows kind of the first point that the British just considered this a mere rebellion, that this was not going to be really anything to worry about. As the British took their time, as according to Glorious Cause by Robert Middlecoff again, the British took until about noon to decide they were going to send their troops over and attack the colonials. Now, they expected that the Americans were just going to flee immediately at the first sign of force. So, as they went over, instead of lining up their troops up in columns, which is the best way to attack up a hill, as again, according to the Glorious Cause, that the attack of Quebec by the French showed that columns was the best way to attack up heights. But instead, as they were going up the hill, the British just longed up in a long line to face the Americans and started marching up the hill. And this time that it took in order for the British to get all their troops over and in a long line gave the Americans the time they needed to continue digging in their defenses, entrench their cannon, and be ready for the British attack, which again just shows the British that the Americans were ready to fight. They were not going to just cow. Now this brings us to the second point, that the Americans, though untrained, could have deadly effect upon the British. Now the British were lined up in this long line to head up the hill, and as they started on up, Breed's Hill, which was the closest hill to Boston, so thus the Americans fortified there. The British were lined up so close together that the Americans could not miss. And this was going to prove costly for the British because at the range that the Americans had against the British coming up the hill, like I said, they could not miss, and the Americans tore huge holes in the British lines and drove them back. Now, according to the British side of the battle, in the Spirit of 76 by Richard Morris, the British officers did a tremendous job of rallying the troops and organizing them again for a second assault up the hill. And thus they did. They reformed and charged again. And while the Americans, according to Colonel Prescott, had a very limited supply of ammunition, they still, again, in the second assault, because the British were lined up in lines, had deadly effect on the British Army and tore jagged holes in the British troops and were successful at driving the British back down the hill again. The leadership of Colonel Prescott and Israel Putnam, I think, were huge, especially in the second attack, because seeing the British Army in all their force was very unnerving for some of the colonial troops, but the courage of their commanding officers held them firm and allowed them to have such a deadly and devastating effect. Now, as a result, the British had vastly underestimated their opponent, showing, the first point again, and the second point that they had already lost large amounts of men. But upon receiving, according to David McCullough's works called 1776, the British received about 400 to 500 more troops in reinforcements from Boston about that time, so they reformed for a third assault up Bunker Hill. Now Prescott knew that his ammunition supply was almost gone, and he didn't want to risk losing his army to the British, so as the British were coming up for the third attack, Prescott ordered his men to retreat, being as that they did not have any more ammunition. Now, this retreat was also contrary to popular opinion. This was not an organized retreat. It was disorderly. It was at times confusing, as you had soldiers, American soldiers, going every which way. But it proved effective because the effectiveness of the American fire the previous 2 times on the British troops had made the British advance up the hill very slow. And so as a result, at the end of the day, the British technically possessed the field and won the battle, but 1,000 to 1,200 untrained American troops had, over 2 assaults, held off almost 2,000 British regulars. And according to Charles Smith's work in my bibliography, the Americans retreated with about 400 total casualties between injured and those who were killed. The British, however, had over 1,000 men that were incapable of seeing action due to injury or those who were killed in the battle. The British had now seen the lethalness of the American fire, which would make both soldiers and commanders more cautious in battles in the future. So that brings us now to our third and final point. In the importance of the Battle of Bunker Hill, the effect on the outcome would influence British tactical strategy and battle maneuvers throughout the rest of the war. According to Robert Morris's work, again, Spirit of 76, General Gage's personal account of the battle, he was in total shock at what had happened to the British Army. He called it a loss greater than I can bear. The British had been pretty much outfought in this battle and now faced serious decisions on what to do with their army. The results of the Battle of Bunker Hill would thus have many ramifications during the years to come in future battles, as many other battles, especially in the northern sector, would see a little more reluctance on the heart of the British to charge into that lethal American fire. And also as a result, we would also see that the British would hire many foreign mercenaries. According to Robert Withington's article, that's also in my bibliography, their cautiousness in wanting to attack the Americans would actually give the Americans either more time to set up for battle, or it would give them more time to safely retreat and thus would not lose an army. And the hiring of foreign mercenaries, as was shown by Robert Middlecoff's work, this would enrage the Americans even more and cause even more to join the ranks in fighting for liberty, as they considered the hiring of foreign troops even a more and greater threat to their liberties. So in looking at the evidence of the battle from historical accounts and the primary source accounts found in Robert Morris's work, I believe the most important battle of the Revolutionary War was the Battle of Bunker Hill. Because after the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British realized that the colonists, though they were not experienced soldiers, they would indeed fight and fight fiercely for their independence. Their training was only going to improve throughout the war, and the colonists already shown that while the British Army was a fearsome sight to behold, they would stand and fight. And as a result, the British would have to change their tactical maneuvering and battle strategies in the battles to come. These are the reasons that I believe that the Battle of Bunker Hill was the most important battle of the war for the American Revolution, because of how it influenced the British to change their battle strategies in the years to come.